Hi, I'm Ricki Spencer, trans sociologist, and today our first inaugural special guest is Matthew Bowden. Matthew Bowden is a human rights activist and he works with the disability community in Victoria. Matthew, welcome.
Hello, Ricki. Nice to meet you.
So tell us a little bit about your journey. What got you involved in human rights?
I suppose I became quite politically active in the 1980s. I grew up in the UK and we had a Tory government that were doing the worst things to people, and particularly the LGBTIQ plus communities. And, this was a time when HIV was, a massive issue in our communities. And, the government were basically waging war on LGBTI people, banning gay books from libraries, making it illegal for teachers to talk about LGBTI rights or our lives in schools. And so I guess that was when I became politically active in a response to a really repressive government.
And sort of what led you to kind of make that position that you took from just witnessing what was happening to thinking, okay, I have to do something about it? Yeah. Was there a particular event or instant in your own life that led you to take action?
Well, I was coming out, at this stage, and it was made more difficult because of the political climate that I was in. And it was really hard to find support. It was really hard to speak out. And I was criminalised, at that point, the age of consent for gay men was 21, whereas it was 16 if you were heterosexual. So, I was experiencing this discrimination. And because I was a young person coming out, my relationships were made illegal, the sex I wanted to have was illegal, and so it was a very difficult time. So the personal became political, and I started becoming involved in organisations when I moved to London that were really politically active, like Outrage, Speak Up, Act Up, all sorts of Terence Higgins Trust. So organisations that were involved in a community response to HIV and AIDS, and basically supporting one another to cope with really, really difficult times.
And what led you to come to Australia?
I wanted to get away from England, really. It was a horrible place to live at that time as a young gay person. And so, I was keen to explore other parts of the world and sort of, shrug off that oppression that I really felt in the UK.
So when you came to Australia, did you notice there was anything different to the experience of being a gay male living in Australia as opposed to living in the UK?
Australia isn't and wasn't perfect, but there were so many more opportunities for a young gay person. I started working in 2010, the Gay and Lesbian Homelessness Service for young people. And I started working there, and, seeing that there were sort of gay identified positions was a really positive thing, something that was hard in the UK to do. Also things like it was possible for same-sex couples to sponsor their partner from overseas. That wasn't something that you could do in the UK at the time. So there were definitely more sort of progressive politics and policies and laws in place in Australia compared to the UK at that point.
And what got you sort of into the area of disability?
I grew up in a family of disabled people. I lived in a community in Cornwall, which was a very inclusive community. There were disabled people as part of the community. The schools that I went to always included people with disability. So that was just, it was a part of my life. And so when I was living in London, I started working with people with intellectual disability, people who'd experienced, lifelong institutionalization and huge amounts of discrimination and disadvantage. And when I was working with them, I'd been working in HIV and in sort of peer support prior to working with people with intellectual disability. And I could see that there were enormous gaps in the sort of knowledge and support and information provided to people with intellectual disability around relationships, sex, sexuality and HIV and harm minimization. So I started doing some work with the people I was working with around HIV awareness and supports around, trans identities, around sexuality, and yeah, that began my journey, I suppose, in a combination of work for disabled people around LGBTIQA plus issues.
I remember also in the early 2000s when I was working as a social worker that the notion of sexuality and disability was still seen as something taboo, especially when it came to LGBTIQ expressions of identity. When you came to Australia and your work in disability spaces, did you find that there was still resistance to people you're working with for people to explore their sexuality, people who were, say, intellectually disabled?
Absolutely. So, and it's still the case today. I mean, I migrated to Australia in the sort of mid-late 1990s, and the situation then, particularly for people with intellectual disability, remains today, where there are so many barriers to people expressing their sexuality, expressing their gender identity, having supports around their variation of sex characteristics. So there's, things have progressed, but there's still a long, long way to go. There are a cast of thousands involved, often in the lives of people with intellectual disability, particularly those who require sort of more support to enable them to live independently. People are still sort of forced into institutional living, forced into living in group homes or in other forms of institution, where it's really hard to make individual choices or to have your identities supported, when you have to kind of share your supports with other people who you're not choosing to live with, but are just compelled to live with to receive supports. There are, the attitudes and values of the support workers, the care providers who come into your home, make an enormous difference. So, sometimes there'll be a person with intellectual disability who is trans, for example. They might need support to go shopping, to buy things like clothes or makeup, and it might be that they get restricted by the support worker who says, no, you are, you're a boy, you're a man, you're not a woman, you're not going to be wearing these clothes, I'm not going to let you buy makeup, wear makeup, etc. And people can be bullied and teased and prevented from being supported to access hormone replacement therapy, or to access other treatments or supports to affirm their identity and support their identity.
You touched on something which is very personal to me, and that is trans identity and disability. In your spaces that you've worked in the last few years, have you found has there been a shift in organisations thinking to be more inclusive, to understand people's gender affirmingness, or is there still a resistance to that?
There is still a resistance. However, there are organisations that are emerging and are reforming around their attitudes and their approach to supporting LGBTIQ plus people with disability. So the emergence of the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which is designed to give more sort of choice and control to the person with disability, rather than the power only being held in the hands of the service provider, as traditionally been the case. We've seen the emergence, for example, of LGBTQ plus service providers, organisations that are very, are queer focused, and so that makes an enormous difference when you know that you are purchasing your supports and services from an LGBTQ plus organisation. There are more organisations listening to their service providers about what it is that they want. The good ones are really doing sort of person-centred approach and person-centred planning very well. And there are organisations that will be taking part in pride marches, the Mardi Gras, etc., and sort of helping, providing their staff with awareness training around LGBTIQ plus issues. So they often will have, policies that support this as well. So, there is change happening, but there's also an awful lot of bad practice still occurring as well.
And Matthew, we spoke briefly previously about your involvement with the Royal Commission. Tell us a little bit about what that Royal Commission, what sort of insights that you gained from that.
So at the moment we have the Disability Royal Commission occurring, which is investigating violence, abuse, neglect and exploitation against people with disability. Within that, there's the terms of reference that the Royal Commission is given by the government, which instructs them how to conduct that inquiry. The inquiry's terms of reference specifically mention lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, plus people with disability. So they need to actually look at that intersectionality, look at the specific forms of violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation that affect our communities, and make findings and recommendations to address those specific forms of violence, our communities, and the unique forms of violence that we experience. Now, the Royal Commission is hearing from individuals with disability. So there are people going into private sessions with a commissioner to tell their story of violence, abuse, neglect, exploitation, which is a way that the Royal Commission is learning about what's happening for LGBTIQA plus people with disability. There are also public hearings, and there are LGBTIQA plus people with disability telling stories, sharing their expertise and experience in public hearings. And so from these and submissions that people are making, researchers making submissions, academics, people with disability are making their own sort of written submissions as well. This is a whole way that the Royal Commission is receiving evidence, understanding what the problem is, and then hopefully making recommendations to make everyone's lives safer, including LGBTIQA plus people with disability.
We're going to announce something really exciting. Tell us a little bit about, as a result of your involvement with the Royal Commission, what's happening in Victoria that you can kind of reveal to us today?
Well, it's really excellent that the Victorian government need to be commended on funding through their grants for LGBTIQA plus organisations, money to help a group of LGBTIQA plus people with disability to form an organisation or explore the idea of forming an organisation. And so I'm working as a consultant to deliver that project, and there are a group of LGBTIQA plus people with disability who've decided that they will form a disabled people's organisation, a human rights organisation that is going to be providing a voice for representing and advocating for the human rights of LGBTIQA plus people with disability. So that's really exciting. There have been groups in the past. There was a group in the 1990s called Access Plus Victoria that was doing this kind of peer support and advocating for LGBTIQA plus disability rights. I don't think that group ever formed an incorporated association. They didn't become a legal entity, but this group are sort of committed to forming an organisation where they will then be in a position to apply for funding, compete for grants, to actually, start employing staff, working on projects to improve the situation, improve the human rights and the lives of LGBTIQA plus people with disability in Victoria, which is really super exciting.
Oh, I'm excited too, because the fact that we can get people coming together to make decisions for people with lived experience with disabilities from our queer community is something that we've been looking for a long time. Just before we wrap up for today, can you tell us, in terms of the people that are on who are currently on the panel, are they representative? Are there people who are trans, people from First Nations?
There's a mixture of people on the Inaugural Management Committee, a range of identities and backgrounds. So there are First Nations people, there are people from a culturally and linguistically diverse background, there are people of different ages. I think the youngest committee member is 18 and the eldest one is probably in their 60s, I think. So there's a nice sort of spread of ages. There's people who are non-binary, there are people who are cisgendered as well. So it's a kind of mixture of people, all of whom have a passion for improving and defending the human rights of LGBTIQA plus Victorians. I sort of met them through either previous work that I've done and through kind of recommendations of the same names kept on sort of cropping up in terms of who might like to be involved. And then I approached people, and sure enough, there was this real eagerness and this real passion to kind of come together as a group to form the organisation and move things forward.
Has the organisation come up with a name yet?
It's in the process of doing that at the moment. So the working title of the project has been Inclusive Rainbow Voices for LGBTIQ plus people with disability. But there are a few names in the mix at the moment that the committee is going to be voting on this week to actually decide on its name going forward. That name will be used for for registering as an incorporated association in Victoria. And then there will be a website and social media and a launch when the name is picked and the committee is ready to go.
Oh, Matthew, we're going to look so forward to hearing about this, and we hope you can come back and give us an update on the journey of this wonderful organisation that will make a difference, we hope, in Victoria and perhaps all around Australia. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to Matthew Bowden, consultant, human rights activist, and altogether caring human being. Thank you for listening today.